Hey guys, this is Kendall Bonner, your RE/MAX broker owner, and wanted to go over contracts with you today. Today's class is going to be specifically on the differences between the as-is contract and some of the other contracts. So this is a class I usually teach first now, and then I teach on the regular FAR bar as part of Contracts 2, and then Contracts 3 is a hybrid of different topics, but more advanced once you know all the differences. So I always like to start my classes off with the thought for the day. The thought for the day is, don't just think it, ink it. You guys know that one, because if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. Very, very, very relevant to contracts. Anyway, so there's three main contracts offered for use in the real estate market right now that we use. That's the CRSP 14. That's this one here. Actually, it's this one here. So CRSP 14, and we know we're in the CRSP 14 because at the bottom of that page it says CRSP 14A. This is not the contract we're reviewing today, but I wanted you to know it is there and how it is titled in app files. Okay. The second contract we often use is the FAR Bar 4. Which is titled in app files here, and at the bottom you can see it's the Florida Realtors Florida Bar -4X, and that is the 4 contract, which is the one I usually recommend once you know how to use it for your traditionally financed buyers. And then finally we have the as-is contract, which of course says as-is at the top, but we all want to make sure we're using the latest version, which is the -4X, which you can see here at the bottom of the page. So, my question to you as we get started today is, have you read these contracts, the 3 of them? Which one do you use and why? Please think about that and answer that for yourself. And then my next question, or number 3, is, what do you know about the differences between them and how you use them, and why one might be better or more appropriate in one situation versus another. My goal at the end of this series is to have agents in our office who are strategic and know the differences between the contracts and now become master negotiators because they understand what they understand what they're doing and how their customers are impacted. So throughout this class we talk about things both from the perspective of the buyer and the seller. So you should be fine in this class whether you consider yourself a listing agent, a buyer specialist, or a hybrid of both. Okay, so let me ask you, do you know what the differences are between the as-is contract and the FAR Bar 4? If you've taken my classes before, you know what they are. There's 3 main differences. Okay, other than the name. So difference number 1 is paragraph, oops, I just passed it, paragraph 9. Paragraph 9 is different than the FAR Bar 4. Okay, the next difference is paragraph 12. Paragraph 12 is different in the as-is contract versus the FAR Bar 4. And then finally, the third difference is X, 18X, which is here, the buyer waiver of claims. Those are your 3 main differences between the FAR Bar 4 and the as-is contract. So what we're going to do today is focus on those 3 differences. And then next class, when we dive into the FAR Bar 4, I will go over the remaining paragraphs and specifically the financing paragraph. That one's a big one that a lot of agents I don't think understand. So please understand that this class assumes you understand page 1. Page 1 is one of the most important pages in the contract. A lot is happening on this page here, and I'm not going to go over that today, but if you need help with that, I would go through my contracts quiz course. That will tell you a lot about that. And if you need me to do a more in-depth class on page 1, please let me know and I'll be happy to do that. Okay, so let's go to page 9. All right, or I mean, sorry, page 3, section 9. So, and actually, you know what? I usually start in 12. Let me go to 12. I think that'll be easier. Let's go to 12. So 12 is your inspection paragraph, okay? So there's 3 things I always tell agents. You need to make your customer aware of these 3 things whenever you're reviewing contracts with them. Number 1, their obligations. Obligations are things the buyer or the seller must do. So in the contract, we're looking for words like shall. Right here, for example, a shall is an obligation. That means if they don't do it, they could be in breach of contract. So we want to make sure we highlight and we note all the shalls in your contract. So that way you know who is supposed to do what. Next, we have opportunities. And then we also have options. Okay, so let me define what's the difference between opportunities and options as I am bringing them to your attention today. Options are buyer has a choice or the seller has a choice. They can do something or they cannot do something. Either way could reflect consequences to the customer, but they basically have a choice. They can do something or not do something, and sometimes that doing or not doing could result in a breach of contract, but it is still their option. They have the choice to breach their contract. Maybe that'll be to their advantage, maybe it won't be. Maybe there'll be some suffering or consequences, i.e. losing a deposit or risk being sued, but the buyer always and the seller always have the option to cancel. But that does not mean that it's not without consequence. Second, I'm going to go back to number 2, which is opportunities. Opportunities are, again, choices that a customer has, but they are usually attached to leverage as opposed to consequences. So it's leverage where they can choose to enforce a breach or use that to renegotiate or to use that to their advantage in some fashion. So if we go through this, if I think of some examples of options and obligations, I'll let you know, but the main key differences are opportunities represent leverage, options often represent consequences. Okay, so section 12, let's read this together. Buyer shall have blank, if left blank, then 15 days after effective date within which to have, and we'll stop here. So this first blank here, don't ever leave it blank. I know it says if left blank then 15, but what happens if you write the buyer's offer, you leave it blank, the seller's not happy with 15 days and they write in 10? Is that going to be drawn to your attention? Are they going to initial? Probably not. But if you write in 15, now they have to actually cross that out, write 10, and that is definitely going to draw your attention when you're scanning through the counter offer or executed offer received from the seller to the buyer. So one of the rules is never leave any blanks, even if it's NA for not applicable or 0. Use something in those blanks. That way, if anyone changes it, you will be made aware right away. Okay, or at least you're more likely to be aware. Okay, so they have 15 days after the effective date, so within which to have such inspections of the property performed as buyer shall desire during the inspection period. So any inspection the buyer wants, right? Whatever the buyer wants. If the buyer wants, the fire department to come out and inspect during the inspection period, they can. If they want to have a termite inspection, permit inspection, general home inspection, all those things need to be done within 15 days. Now, real quick, I want to talk about timing. The date the contract is delivered between the parties, what day is that in the timeline? Is that day 0 or day 1? What do you think? I'm going to tell you that the delivery day, the way that I have been taught to calculate it, is 0. So day 1 starts tomorrow if it was delivered today. Even if it was delivered today at 11:59, that's day 0. At 12:01, that is day 1. Okay, so it's really important as soon as you get those items back from your customers that you get them out to the co-broke, the other agent, as soon as possible. Okay, so if the buyer determines in buyer's sole discretion that the property is not acceptable to the buyer, buyer may terminate this contract by delivering written notice of such election to the seller prior to expiration of the inspection period. So that means on or before day 15. So day 15, it expires at midnight, okay? You've got to deliver written notice of your customer's decision to cancel the contract or terminate the contract. If you fail to do this, well, we'll read about that next. If the buyer timely terminates this contract, the deposit shall be returned to the buyer. Thereupon the buyer and the seller shall be released, and all further obligations shall be released of all other further obligations on the contract. However, the buyer shall be responsible for prompt payment for such inspections, for repair of damage to and restoration of the property resulting from such inspections. Okay, and shall provide seller with paid receipts for all work done on the property. The preceding provision shall survive termination of this contract. So before we get to that, so basically, if the buyer does not deliver written notice, they may lose their deposit if there's not another contingency attached to the contract. So if there were a cash deal, for example, and they neglected, or you neglected as an agent to deliver written notice to the seller that they wish to cancel, buyer could lose their EMD potentially. If they do deliver notice of cancellation, then they are entitled to their EMD back. Okay. Now, the preceding provision shall survive termination of contract. So basically, if the buyer damages the property during their inspections, they are responsible for it and have to repair the home and bring it back into the condition that it was in. Now, this happened to me for the first time of all the hundreds of listings that I've had and inspections and everything. This finally did happen to me. During a home inspection, the buyer's home inspector turned on the water faucet to check the running water in one of the bathroom sinks, and apparently accidentally plugged it and forgot to unplug it and walked away. And the bathroom flooded. And not only did the bathroom flood, but it flooded into the hallway, into the master bedroom, and even out into the formal living room. The agent and the buyer were, of course, embarrassed and tried to clean it up. And I really think maybe even might have tried to hide it, but it didn't. It was way more water than they really realized. And so they ended up having to tell us because there was evidence throughout the house that this had occurred. So once we found out, the sellers were, of course, irate and upset for numerous reasons, but the baseboards in the bathroom floor started to peel off the sides of the walls, and the carpet was so wet that it was actually the efforts to dry it wouldn't dry. So they had to lift the carpets and bring in one of those industrial dryers, and a company had to come out and actually dry the floors and the wood professionally, because otherwise it was going to start stinking and molding. So the buyer did have to pay for that. They wrote a check direct out to the company who did the restoration, and that did get done prior to closing. Okay, so that is something. Now, another way that could be handled is, if the contract terminates, you could pull that from the deposit, or if the contract is going forward, you should get something in writing from the buyer saying, hey, we screwed up, but we accept the home as is. And if it doesn't close, we will pay for the restoration. Okay. So going back to this paragraph here. So unless the buyer exercises the right to terminate granted herein, buyer accepts the physical condition of the property and any violation. and any violation of governmental, building, environmental, and safety codes, restrictions, or requirements. Okay, so that means they are getting the house truly as is. So notice there is nothing in here that says if it's not acceptable, they get to ask for repairs or anything like that. It just says either you take the house as it comes or you don't take it at all. Okay, now here's your but. So we're going to deal with this and your and. These are two new statements. But subject to seller's continuing as-is maintenance requirement. So let's just deal with that. Do you guys know what the as-is maintenance requirement is? All right, so I'm going to tell you it's super easy and it's right on the same page. Paragraph 11, property maintenance. Except for ordinary wear and tear and casualty loss, seller shall maintain the property, including but not limited to lawn, shrubbery, and pool in the condition existing as of the effective date. That's the as-is maintenance requirement. So what does that mean? If it was broke on the day that you went under contract, it can remain broke as of closing. However, if it was working on the day of contract and it was broken, a week before closing, the seller is responsible for fixing it, even under an as-is contract. So if it was working at the time of contract, it's got to be working at the time of closing. Okay, that's the as-is maintenance requirement. Okay, if you have any questions about that, see me. Now, let's go back here. And buyer shall be responsible for any and all repairs and improvements required by the buyer's lender. So if you work in my office, you're probably pretty familiar with that line. That one's a doozy for me. So my favorite paragraph in this contract, or my favorite line in this contract is in this paragraph, and my least favorite line is in this paragraph. So, when working with the buyer, my favorite line is, if buyer determines in buyer's sole discretion that the property is not acceptable, buyer can terminate the contract. I love that line. That's great. That's giving some power back to the buyer. However, this last line here, buyer shall, that's what we already determined on shall, that's an obligation, be responsible for any and all repairs and improvements required by the buyer's lender. So when might a buyer's lender require repairs or improvements? Yes, I think I've heard it. The appraisal, right? So the lender's appraisal may ask for, roof repair, some sort of maintenance repair. Now, under this contract, what's not good is that the buyer's done their inspection and they've determined the house is acceptable as is, but now the appraisals come back and said, hey, we think there's an issue. Well, there's nothing here that allows a buyer to go back and ask the seller to fix it. In fact, it says the buyer is now obligated, right? That's what we determined shall means, is obligated and responsible for taking care of those issues. Now, there is an exception to this rule, and we will go over that shortly. But I do want to make sure that I point out to you that the exception to the rule is very specific, and in order to combat that, we have to do a couple of different things. So I'm actually going to go back to the top so I can show you the exception to the rule, and I'm going to pop this out and shrink it. So now we're here. So the exception to the rule, so what's the scariest part is the worst case scenario, right, is FHA. You have an FHA buyer who is buying a house. They wrote, you wrote an as-is contract, and now the FHA appraisers come back and said it needs a roof repair. They found a roof leak. So under this addendum here, oops, if I can get it to scroll for me, we have some paragraphs here that help us. Okay, so section 2, in addition to the requirements of paragraph 12 of the FAR bar contract, buyer shall comply with applicable FHA and VA regulations regarding the termite inspection, roof inspection, and appraisal repairs. The cost to seller for appraisal repair shall not exceed, an amount, which cost is in addition to any cost required under 9A, 12B, C, or D. That's if you use the FAR bar 4. Those would have numbers there, but otherwise it's 0 as it relates to the as is. So, you can put 0 here. You could put, whoops, that's not 0. You could put 0. You could put $500. This is to the seller, not the buyer. Notice, right? This is a cost to the seller. So in your as-is contract, you have 0 for regular repairs, but here you can put a repair limit to the seller, not to exceed some amount. Okay, so that's important there. The next part of this is appraisal repairs, this paragraph here. So if the cost of appraisal repairs exceeds the limit imposed by paragraph 2, so it's greater than your $500, seller must, within 3 days after receiving the notice of the excessive cost or the excess cost, give the purchaser or the buyer written notice of their intention to pay some, all, or none of the excess. So they're obviously obligated to $500. So let's use an example. Let's say the repair is $750. Okay, the seller now can pay just $500. They can pay $750, or they can say, "Hey, we'll pay $675. You pay the difference, buyer." Okay. However, if the seller elects to pay less than the full amount, the buyer now can elect to pay it or cancel. So this is a safety net even for the FAR bar as is. The buyer does get an out and not have to make the repairs as long as they're using this addendum. So the buyer's election must be in writing and provided to the seller within 3 days after receiving written notice of the seller's election. So mind you, there's all these shalls and must, right? So these are obligations. So a lot of writings. So you need writings, right, between the parties. Now, is an email sufficient? I will say for notice, typically, I think an email could work, but is that the best practice? I would say no. Best practice would be to get your customer to sign something. So whether you send it in some sort of request for repairs, notice, or some sort of addenda, getting the parties to sign and acknowledge receipt and is best practice. In my opinion, and should really be the only way you do this. People remember what's in their best interest 3, 6, 9, 12 months from now. So the more you have writings where the customer's actually signed off on it, the more powerful your argument's going to be that you didn't do anything wrong and that you were just operating under your customer's request and wishes. Okay, so I would say whenever possible, get it in an addendum and signed by all parties. Okay, the rest of this is about VA. Okay, so what happens if you don't have a FHA or VA finance buyer, but you have a conventional buyer, or better yet, a USDA buyer? Okay, most people don't use this addendum when working with USDA and or conventional, but you're using the as-is contract and you want to limit their liability or responsibility or obligation under the FAR bar as-is contract paragraph 12. So what I would do is I don't recommend you make up language. I recommend you, highlight and paste the appropriate paragraphs here and put them in highlight the appropriate paragraphs and put them in the additional terms section at the end of your paragraph. So at the end of your contract. So that's and then of course changing it from FHA or VA to with applicable USDA regulations regarding termite, for example, or with applicable conventional loan regulations regarding etc. So please take out FHA or VA, or leave it in there and say comma USDA, comma conventional loan, depending on what's applicable. Okay, so that is what I would recommend if you're trying to limit the exposure to the customer, to the buyer, when financing a home and using the FAR/BAR as-is contract. Okay, so let's go back to that contract. Is that this one? Yep, here we go. So, so we just looked at paragraph 12. Now we're going to look at paragraph 9. Let's go backwards a little bit here. And paragraph 9 here, what's important here is, one, in the paragraph 9 of the FAR/BAR 4, when we look at that in next class, you'll see the main differences, because mainly it's a lot of missing here. It's a much shorter paragraph here than in as-is, as opposed to the FAR/BAR 4. And what's mainly missing as well is the repair limit. So the general repair limit, the permit repair limit, and the WDO repair limits are in paragraph 9 of the other contract. So here, as you can see, we don't have that. But what I do want to point out to you is this paragraph here. If prior to closing, seller is unable to meet the as-is maintenance requirement as required by paragraph 11, which we did talk about, a sum equal to 125% of the estimated cost to meet the as-is maintenance requirement shall be escrowed at closing. So what does that mean? So basically, if the pool was supposed to be working at the time of closing and it's not, and we got a repair limit, or we have a repair estimate, for $1,000, then $1,250 has to be held in escrow at closing, or withheld from the seller's proceeds, okay, to have the pool repaired. If actual cost to meet the as-is maintenance requirement exceeds the escrowed amount, meaning it's more than the $1,250, seller shall pay actual costs. So if it's $1,500, the seller is going to have to add another $250. However, if any unused portion of the escrow amounts, or if there are any, then they shall be returned to the buyer. So if it turns out it's actually $900 or $1,000 for that matter, they'll get their remaining balance of $250 back. Okay? That's an important change. And this is actually different. This little section here is different and has different consequences here than it does in the FAR/BAR 4. And when we do that class, I'll point that out to you when we get to that section. Okay? And then lastly, I want to discuss paragraph 18. And that's here. Okay. And paragraph 18X. So this paragraph right here is also not in the FAR/BAR 4. It is only in the FAR/BAR as-is. So this is the buyer's waiver of claims. To the extent permitted by law, buyer waives any claims against the seller and against any real estate licensee involved in the negotiation of this contract for any damage or defects pertaining to the physical condition of the property that may exist at closing of this contract and be subsequently discovered by the buyer or anyone claiming by, through, under, or against the buyer. This provision does not relieve seller's obligation to comply with paragraph 10J. This standard X shall survive closing. So what's paragraph 10J? I know what that paragraph is, but I'm going to show it to you. This paragraph basically should reflect the seller's obligations to disclose to the buyer any known material defects that impact the value of the property. And let's see if I'm right. It's a 10J, right? Yep, seller's disclosure. So seller knows of no facts materially affecting the value of the real property, which are not readily observable and which have not been disclosed to the buyer. Except as provided for in the preceding sentence, seller extends and intends no warranty and makes no representation of any type, either express or implied, as to the physical condition or history of the property. Except as otherwise disclosed in writing, seller has received no written or verbal notice from any governmental entity or agency as to currently uncorrected building, environmental, or safety code violations. So they're basically saying the seller's kind of proactively saying, I don't know of any permit issues, I don't know of any defects. Who is this seller we're really talking about most of the time? our REO bank sellers, right? Of course, they know nothing when in fact they probably know way more than they ever disclose. But this is their X is their protection, saying, hey, you can't later sue us because we didn't know anything. Now, they're not, this paragraph though still applies even under 18X. So if a buyer can prove that the seller knew about a latent defect, okay, which means a hidden defect, so something, a fact materially affecting the value of the property that was not readily observable, and also failed to disclose it to the buyer, so i.e. like a sinkhole, there's a repaired sinkhole. We all know that repairs for sinkholes often happen underground. And so when you look at the home, you can't look at a home and tell it has a sinkhole all the time. Sometimes, sure, you can, but a lot of times you can't tell. So the seller knew but didn't tell the buyer. That would be a problem. And because there's definitely, we all know there's a stigma associated with sinkhole properties, and that would and could affect someone's desire to purchase it or not. And so if that's just an example. That's not the only example, of course, but that's an example. And that is something that even if after they closed, the buyer could still sue the seller for that if the seller knew and they could prove that they knew. Okay, so that does make it complicated, proving knowledge, but that is usually considered fraud. The F word, that's the big fraud, and does survive closing. Okay. Now, let's say the buyer knew about a problem and discovered it during the home inspection, didn't cancel, and went through the contract and closed it, and then later said, wait, this is worse than what I thought. It costs more than what I thought because maybe they didn't do a thorough investigation of the expense. I would say that this paragraph would apply in that situation. The buyer has waived their right to sue the seller regarding defects pertaining to the physical condition of the property that exists at the time of closing. Okay, so that's an interesting paragraph. I don't know why that paragraph's in there per se. I really don't, but it's in there. And if I learn anything new about why it's in there, I'll definitely write that in the notes above the course there, or above this contract. So here you've got all your addenda, and these are your additional term paragraphs. Remember I talked about the FHA VA language. If you're going to use the language and not the actual addendum because you're dealing with the conventional or USDA loan, this is where you would put that here, is in the additional terms section. Please don't write your own language. I would use current existing language from other addenda to add in here in order to make that a stronger contract for your customer. Okay, so these are the main differences between the as-is and the FAR 4. I want to encourage you to watch the FAR 4 class now, so that way you can learn about 1, 9, 12, and 8. And paragraph 8 is the financing paragraph and is the same in both contracts. So that's a real important class for you to watch as well. All right, thank you so much, and have a great day. If you have any questions, thoughts, comments, please don't hesitate to email myself or Shad or Bill. We're happy to answer those emails for you. And you'll notice in the app file section here, if you go, all of you are in it, so if you go into search and you type in contracts, you'll get KEB's contracts class and docs, and when you click on that, it'll take you here, and this is where I'm storing all the contracts we're working on and what I'm teaching on, as well as any additional documents. Now, it's important I talked to you about timing and calculating days. One of the things I want to make sure you know is that the FAR bar contracts, the FAR bar as is, and the FAR bar 4 work on calendar days, and the CRSP or CRSP 14 is a business day contract. Now, what happens when the contract deadline falls on a legal holiday? Well, that's in your contract. It tells you what happens, but how do we calculate legal holidays? Well, I went and looked it up. So here you'll find in this course the different legal holidays that you can utilize. Now, I want to point one out to you because I find it very interesting. That's not a legal holiday, and that is the day after Thanksgiving. So Thanksgiving Day is considered a holiday, but let's say you have a deadline on the Friday after Thanksgiving. That is not listed here, so that would not count for an extension. So that's, I think, super important for you to realize if you have a deadline that falls on that sweet spot. That can work to your advantage or to your disadvantage, because a lot of people will think it's a holiday and it is not a legal public holiday according to the U.S. Statute 5, Section 6103. All right. Then also I want to point out to you, since we're in here, is language for business. This is that page I'm always emailing out to you guys because it's just got some common language you should use for various contract and documents that you're using. So down here at the bottom, this is buyer contract language. So this is stuff you can throw into that additional terms section. So seller agrees to pay up to, fill in the blank, 3%, 4%, 5% towards buyer's prepaids, closing costs, not allowables. POC is paid outside of closing, discount points, and any other fees or costs. So what does that mean? So your buyer might be able to get back their home inspection. You might be able to get back, getting repaid or getting money towards your discount points. Because a lot of lenders, if your closing costs and things don't equal up to 3%, they just give the balance back to the seller. So the more you can throw in to the mix, the more you're able to collect and have the buyer take full advantage of the entire 3%. Okay. Next, we have the buyer and seller agree that buyer, at his or her sole discretion, you remember that language? My favorite language from as is. I put this in my FAR bar 4s. May determine that the property is not acceptable to the buyer, and buyer may terminate this contract by delivering written notice of such election and cancellation to the seller on or before expiration of the inspection period. If the buyer timely terminates, the buyer shall get their refund or refunded their full deposit, and all parties are released. Seller to provide buyer with any and all HOA documents, notice of fees, contact information for association, and our management company within 7 calendar days of effective date. If no association is required or exists, seller to notify buyer in writing within 7 days of effective date. Seller to provide buyer with seller's prior survey within 7 days of effective date and written explanation of any changes. So if they got a fence or added a pool, and or exceptions to surveys since last performed, if any. If no survey is available, then seller to notify the buyer in writing within 7 calendar days of effective date. Seller agrees to include all current chattel in and on the property as a part of this real estate transaction. This section here, let's not use that, guys, unless you know if the customer really wants it. So what is chattel? Chattel is like all the furniture, all the personal property of the seller. So I personally had a deal. The reason why this is on here is because I had a deal. I had $1 million buyer who purchased, a $1 million home. And this was going to be like their second home. It wasn't their primary home. And they were probably going to be renting it out during the summers as an investment and just spend a couple months a year there. So they wanted fully furnished so they wouldn't have to refurnish it. And so the seller sold them all their stuff, minus, the bed sheets and the clothes in their closet and their, but I even think they left some of their silverware and glasses and plates and all the furniture and most of the art and decorations were all left with the home. Now the chattel is a big deal. So sellers may not want to leave certain pieces. So it's important that you make a list of whatever the shortest list is. So the shortest list, if it's what the seller's taking versus what the seller's leaving, I would choose the shortest list to write up in an addendum if they're not going to truly leave all of the chattel or all of the personal property. Okay? All right, guys. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, reach out to me. Send me an email. You might even want to write it as an update and just notice me in the activity here. That way people can read and see each other's questions. And as I update documents in here, I'll label them and keep them on the side. Okay, I ask that you guys not really mess with the documents here, just so that way everyone can see the same thing at the same time and be on the same page. Okay, all right. Thank you so much, guys. Talk to you soon.